Well, it's good to see this number assembled again this afternoon, and I'm so glad that you're here. You have stayed with us during the course of the day, and I like Brother Jim, echo the sentiments that welcome you here. Those that may be visiting from around the area, we're grateful for your coming. I know that it's a little bit of a test for you at this particular hour. I know how I am. My body is normally calling for me to be asleep just about this time, and so my task is trying to keep you awake during this time. And so perhaps we may be able to accomplish that goal during the course of the next few minutes. But so glad that you have stayed with us this afternoon, incidentally. For those that had prepared such a marvelous feast for our lunch this afternoon, you did a splendid job. And I'm sure I'll enjoy that for the next few hours. I'll hopefully wear that well. But it was good, and I appreciate that so very much. And I'm thankful for the kind hospitality. As I mentioned in the previous hour, our studies this morning and then this afternoon will be taken from statements that are found in the 13th chapter of the book of Hebrews. And so if you have your Bibles, you might be turning along with us as we contemplate again some things that are found within this text that fit within the context of some of the admonitions that the apostle felt necessary for those Christians during that time that were facing impending persecutions, which were going to be quite severe. And for the case of those who may not have been here in the previous hour, you might take this into account, that the reason why that much of what you're finding written in the book is addressing particular problems that these Hebrew Christians were going to be facing, particularly as they were being pressed, I'm sure, on every side by tradition, by Judaistic teachers and things of this nature. And so the apostle is trying to set in proper order exactly how the scheme of redemption has come to fruition in and through Christ. And it was not through the law of Moses. But now knowing that they were going to be submitted or have to be exposed to a significant amount of persecution, and the persecution was about to become significant, that they were going to need to follow some of these admonitions that he is expressing here within the text of Hebrews the 13th chapter. We began our study this morning in looking at verse 1, where he's mentioning the principle of let brotherly love continue. That was especially going to be needed during that time, and I don't think that it's without significance that he chooses that as the very first admonition as he starts these particular points that you're finding within this chapter. He's also going to emphasize the need for hospitality and having a benevolent spirit that you're seeing in verses 2 and 3. But we might find it somewhat odd in the lineup of many of these admonitions how verse 4 might fit into this. Verse 4 tells us marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. But whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. One might wonder as to why it is that he's fitting that within that context. Obviously it's the case, as they're being pressed also not only by those among the Judaizers, but they're also having to live among the influence of those that especially would be the case subsequent to the destruction of Jerusalem, where they're going to have to be in context and around about with many of those that would have been Gentiles. And they were been having to do that for quite some time because they were operating under the auspices, under the thumb of Rome anyway, for quite some time. Most of those people had no real interest whatsoever in things spiritual. Most of them were idealistic as far as in pagan in nature. Some of them were being influenced by what they had seen, like Cornelius had been, and trying to turn things toward the law of God, and at least to submit to the way that God would teach and learning of the God of heaven. But now these people here, when they leave their homes and they're going to have to go through much of this persecution, well, the tendency on occasion would have to kind of move themselves away from the way of right, as we intimated in our earlier study. If in fact that there were those that would not take into account the need for moral purity, and if they were to depart from God's way in that respect, then the path to apostasy is just another step away in completely destruction as far as their souls were concerned. Not to mention the fact that if they were going to try to straddle the fence between trying to hold certain aspects of what Jesus would have taught and then carrying on immoral practices and things of this nature, that is going to be perceived by others, among those that would not be Christian. They're not going to have any reason to be compelled to want to become a Christian if there are those that are hypocritical in their behavior. If in fact that they were to follow such a teaching that Jesus delivered back in Matthew the 19th chapter, that may be perceived here as they understand Jesus as being the supreme lawgiver. Hebrews chapter 1, 1 and 2, God who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in times past, and to the fathers by the prophets hath in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things. They are to come to the realization of what their expectation was on a marital basis. If they are to come to a comprehension of how God had set the parameters for sexual purity, then perhaps that might be something that others would also perceive as the right way that they should go even in their life. But the status of the church and the purity of the church was being, I think, directed clearly by the statements that Paul is making within these statements here. We take into account the statement that he does make in chapter 13, verse 4, and make a quick appraisal, if you would, as I appealed a little while ago in our previous hour. If you're just to surmise, as you think about our present society, what kind of state that it is in, and it is obviously in a state of moral decay. Some of us were talking just a little while ago about this very problem. And we're watching our society just crumble right before our eyes. We're seeing much of that which we would have never thought would ever come about as affecting us as a nation now. But these very things not only affecting the nation, they're affecting certain elements of the church. We're being affected by the problems which he has intimated within this text. There are those that are obviously, through the years, have purported an idea or ideas about the concept of God's laws on marriage which are altogether foreign from what God has stated. So you look again at the statement there, marriage is honorable in all. That is a statement that in fact is diametrically opposed to the teaching of Catholicism. Now, I don't mean to pick on somebody by name, but it's just a matter of record. And the reason why I'm called that name is the matter of the record, and that some of the things that they have taught through the centuries, we are now reaping what they have sown through all these centuries. I had to do some research last year for a lecture that I delivered in Florida. The theme of the lectureship had to do with the history of religion beginning with the 1st century through 1300s. My assignment had to do with the overview of the Catholic Church. Spending some time in doing that, I did a significant amount of research and study about the popes. And one of the things I learned about those fellows is, as I stated to somebody a little while ago, I would not want to be with one of them in judgment. These were some of the most vile individuals you could ever read about. They put on the pretense of holiness and piety, and they were some of the most unscrupulous scallywags that you could ever imagine. There were several of them. I know one of them had 14 illegitimate children by 14 different women. And this is just simply some of those, that's just the hem of the garment, friends. This is just some of what it is and the practices in which they engage. Now, there's a background for all of this. And if you go to what it is that the Apostle Paul has suggested here, in context with other things he had stated, he had prophetically referenced those particular things. Back over in 1 Timothy chapter 4. Remember, beginning verse 1, now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies in hypocrisy. having their conscience seared with a hot iron. Now watch. Forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from meats which God had created be received with thanksgiving by them that believe and know the truth. You've got two elements that he is prophetically pointed out is going to be consistent with the way that these particular people uphold this teaching. They believe, particularly in respect to their minister, that celibacy is a higher state of purity than in marriage. And I want to show you some of the things that they have stated. Now, before I even get into that, now there's a certain element of truth that they have tried to apply in this respect. One of the reasons why I'm saying it is because they base some of what they suggest on statements that Paul made in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And you remember what he was addressing. You know, you start in chapter 5 and you go through chapter 7, he's dealing with moral issues. Because of the situation where the fellow there in Corinth had taken his stepmother away from his father. These are kinds of things that you remember that Paul mentioned. These were some things not even named among the Gentiles, and yet we're seeing that this was the case here. So he starts dealing with issues of moral problems. When you come into chapter 7, he says, I would wish that all men would be as myself. Well, what's he talking about? He was unmarried. And he goes on to mention every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this matter, another after that. But I say even unto the unmarried and the widows, it's good for them to abide even as I. Well, some of them have taken that issue right there and said, well, you know, Paul is stating this is the best thing then for our ministers to be that way, then they should be celibate. But then Paul is not telling them that is a lesser state of purity. And of course, they don't even understand, nor do they appreciate what the concept of celibacy is all about. And I'm about to show you that. Because here you take from what also Apostle Paul is going to suggest, if there are those that are even contemplating marrying, they have this yearning one for the other. Well, that's a natural thing, is it not? And the Apostle Paul goes on to say, if they're burning one toward another like that, let them marry. Well, if in fact that is something that is a more unholy state than celibacy, he wouldn't have told them that. But listen to some of the things that they state. Just to make it clear the fact that that's not something that I have presented, but the reason why again I'm presenting these things is because this has become a basic foundation to the way many people think in our society now. It has been influenced by this. Catholic Encyclopedia, Volume 4, page 207. Quote, permanent concubinage is not immoral. Now that won't make you just shake your head. Permanent concubinage is not immoral. Now that kind of gives you an idea of the state that these people are in. I've got an article here, an old article, from the Kansas City Star that I obtained some years ago. The title of the article is Priests Dying of AIDS at Higher Rate. Roman Catholic priests in the United States are dying from AIDS-related illnesses at a rate 4 times higher than the general population, and the cause is often concealed on their death certificate. The Kansas City Star reported. In the first of a 3-part series, the newspaper said death certificates and interviews with experts indicated several hundred priests have died of AIDS-related illnesses since the mid-1980s, and hundreds more are living with HIV, the virus that causes the disease. The Star received 801 responses to questionnaires that were sent to 3,000 of the 46,000 priests in the United States. The margin of error in this was 3.5 percentage points, and this is some of the stuff they asked them. They asked them about their sexual orientation. Now, why would that be an issue if they were supposed to be celibate? But their sexual orientations, 75% said they were heterosexual, 15% said they were homosexual, 5% said they were bisexual. Again, why would that be an issue? If in fact that this is something that they are supposedly not to be engaged in, why is it that they are engaged in it? Well, let me give you an idea. New Code of Canon Law, page 208. This is what they say about their position regarding their priest. Quote, an accomplice, that is a partner in guilt, who is in danger of death. Let me explain what he's getting at here. Here you've got a priest that's involved in fornication. He's carrying on with one of his concubines. He's not condemned because he's a priest. But now the woman that he's carrying on with, she's in danger of death because she's in sin. But no worry, because what it is that simple statement here in the New Canon Law says, he's not having to worry about his situation, but he can absolve her. He just absolves her of her sin, so now she's fine. So everybody's good. Everybody's happy. So he can just carry on whatever it is that he wants to do. He doesn't have to worry about it because he's not married, and because he carries on this activity, he's not being affected by it anyway. He's affected her, but he can forgive her. He just absolves her, and they just go their way. You have perhaps getting the idea now as to how it is. Here's one of the largest religious organizations exist in the world, and that particular type of thinking has had its effect upon our society as a whole. Explanation of Catholic Morals, page 149. Which here is talking about, according to these writings here, the priests don't break their vows of chastity when they commit adultery. This is not what they say. Quote, all celibates are not chaste. Let that sink in. All celibates are not chaste. How's that? Continue. One who takes the vow of celibacy does not break it. By sinning against the sixth commandment, he is true to it till he weds. Unquote. So in other words, as a priest, I can carry on my fornicative activities. I don't have to worry about that at all. And the fact of the matter is, I can do that and not have to worry about breaking the sixth commandment, which is thou shalt not commit adultery. I don't have to worry about that at all unless I'm married, which I can't do. And if as a priest I'm married, I sin. Because you see, marriage is dishonorable where their ministers are concerned. Now you try to make sense of that. I said and went over this and looked over it, and it's hard for me to comprehend how anybody could look at this, especially when they're supposed to be purveyors of the Bible, purveyors of the truth in Christ, and yet you take the passage here that Paul makes his statement in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, it says marriage is honorable where? In all. That includes those that would be married. And the marriage bed is undefiled. Where? In all. That means anything other than the marriage bed, it is defiled. And that includes minister too. And yet they have to dismiss that. They have to look over that. And yet we see also the fact that Jesus honored the marriage relationship and the marriage institution when he attended the marriage feast in Cana in John the 2nd chapter, and you remember that. What this position, what these positions indicate, what it's encouraging, and what we have seen as the fruit of this kind of position that these people are taking, it's actually encouraging the practice of fornication. But yet that's something that's condemned, isn't it? When you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, what do you find? There are 3-4 verses that you'll notice within that text that's addressed by the Apostle Paul on this matter. In verse 9 of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he's pointing out, just like he does in Galatians chapter 5, the works of the flesh. And you remember in Galatians 5:19 through 21, he talks about adultery, fornication, uncleanness, and all of these things, all of which in verse 21, that those that would do even such things, such like things, will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, that's the same thing he's doing here in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Those that will not enter the kingdom of heaven, the first on the list again, are those that are fornicators. Look down to verse 13. Verse 13, he tells us that the body is not for fornication, but for the Lord. Look at verse 18. What's the first phrase? Flee fornication. Now, how is it that groups of people that are supposed to be purveyors of the Bible, those that are supposed to be advocates of the Scriptures, are so unmindful of those texts? Well, evidently, they've been marked out of theirs. That's not something that's found within there. Because you see, as we've already pointed out, according to their kind of law, anybody that commits any such thing, it's not something about which they have to be concerned. It's amazing to me. And then you take into account, again, what Paul had stated as to what we need to do to try to avoid this kind of problem. So continue. Look down in chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians as he's continuing these thoughts. Let's just read together, would we? Verses 2 through 5. Now, if you're looking at the King James, you're going to note that there's part of that first phrase that's found right there. It's not in the original, but it's implied, obviously. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication. Why would Paul need to mention that if there was no problem in anybody doing it? Particularly anyone other than those that were priests. Well, that's right. We keep forgetting he can absolve them anyway. So that's not a problem. He's not going to have to deal with it anymore. Yes, he does, because he's telling right here there's a reason why this is mentioned. He is required to avoid it. That's what the command is. And here's how we do it. Let every man have his own wife, and every wife have her own husband, and let the husband render unto the wife the due benevolence. If in fact that desire is arisen in him or her, they are to come together. That's where that relationship is to be satisfied. That's the parameters of sexuality that God has established. Because the wife has not the power of her own body, but the husband has not the power of his own body, but the wife. And so he says, defraud ye not one another, except it be for a time, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer, but then you come together again. And so that you do this in a expeditious fashion, so that Satan not tempt you for your incontinency, for your lack of control. And for those, in fact, who again, as we pointed out just a moment ago, who may be contemplating marriage. Here you've got two people who come together in love with one another. They're attracted to one another. They want to be with one another. And it comes to the point that journey becomes very, very strong. What is it that Paul tells them they need to do? Verse 9. They cannot contain, let them marry, because it's better they marry than burn. Right? For some reason or the other, there have been many within our society have failed to come to the realization of what God has taught in respect to this issue. Now, why is it that we bring it up? Because we're seeing it affected in our society. What was it that President Lincoln said a long time ago? As the home goes, so goes the nation. Had a lot of truth in that. And when you start seeing a particular doctrine like this is being expressed, and then you see it coming to where many are applying this idea that marriage is not something that's important. You know, the percentage of marriages in our country is plummeting. Less and less people are engaging in the marital relationship. And that's having its effect even on the church as well. Now, this begs the question concerning marriage, what has been its purpose to start with? You know, you go back to the second chapter of the book of Genesis, after God made Adam. Also, that other beasts had been made, other animals. They're brought before Adam and he names them. There's something God recognizes in this situation. He looks down upon this and he sees that there is nothing to which Adam can relate. There's nothing compatible with him. And so he will apply this heavily anesthesia on him and put him to sleep, and will administer the first open-bodied surgery, incising him, taking from him a rib from his side, closing him back up, taking the rib, forming the woman from the rib, bringing her to the man, call her a woman, for she was taken out of the man. And then made the statement you're seeing in Genesis 2:24, which was repeated, you remember, by the Lord in Matthew 19. You remember in that section, he'd been asked about marriage situation. Is it lawful for us to put away our wives for any cause? Jesus says, have you not read, he that made them from the beginning made them male and female, and made also this point, he's quoting here from Genesis 2:24, that a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall become one flesh. Incidentally, that's interesting language, and it's relevant. That a man leave his father and his what? His mother. How is it that he came about to start with? There had to be a man and a father and a mother in order for him to come about. It's not any other way. This is how it is that God has put this in motion for us today. It's never changed. Even though we're in 2019, this particular precept has not changed. You want to have a son, it's going to take a father and it's going to take a mother in order to make him. Now, in addition to this, this fella here, he's got to leave father and mother that made him and cleave unto his wife. And thereby there's several things that are accomplished. Number one, is satisfied the lack of incompatibility that he had with other creatures. There was nothing else. And this was the only thing that would be. So she was the help that would be meet for him. And she's going to supply all of that need in that respect, where nothing else could do that. Number two, there was going to be the need for procreation. And this is the only means by which that is going to be accomplished. It can't be accomplished by any other thing. He couldn't have a wife if he never was, and he never would be unless there'd been a father and mother to make him. But all of this brings about the importance of that compatibility. And every one of us are in need of that. Some of the things that Solomon said, I've always found to be a little bit interesting. And the reason why I say it's somewhat interesting from him is considering his background. We know when he's talking to his son in Proverbs chapter 19, he mentioned in Proverbs 19 that a prudent wife cometh from the Lord. Here's one who is wise. Here's one who has good sense about it. Here's one that has an interest in his well-being. That's one that comes from the Lord. That's one where you can be truly thankful. Go back in chapter 13, he that findeth a wife findeth a good thing. Why is that important coming from Solomon? He had 300 of them, he ought to know. Now, if he wasn't satisfied with the 300 wives, he had 700 concubines on top of that. You ever thought about that? What that man must have lived through just during the course of a year. There's only 365 days in a year. If he has the urge that he has to carry out to fulfill himself sexually, he might see one of them in a year. He'll wait next year, we'll be back around. He might get 2 a day. It's just it's just an odd thing, but you kind of sit around and you think about things like this, and he takes all of this in consideration. Why is the wife a good thing? Particularly if he's interested in his spiritual well-being, and his were not. That's the reason why he finds himself at odds with God. Now he finds eventually the need to return and to come to his spiritual senses. That's the reason why he's telling these things to his son in the book of Proverbs. It's one of those statements that we've learned: don't do what I do, do what I say do, don't do what I've done. And that's kind of the situation. I've already been there, I've done that, I know the problems that come as a result of this. Let's take a different path and let's do things God's way. That's what he's trying to get across here. You know, there are some, and you can look at both sides of the aisle, whether you're talking about the wife or the husband, but since we're looking at it from the standpoint of these particular texts, there's some occasions that you'll find there be wives that can lead people away, can lead you away. Think about that situation in Luke the 14th chapter. You remember Jesus telling a little bit of a parable here, but there was a fellow that put on the great feast, and he sent out invitations. And when the invitations went out, there were some that when they received them began to make excuses as to why they shouldn't come. One of them had bought 5 yoke of oxen, I got to go prove them. The other one said, I bought a plot of ground, I got to go see about it. The other one says, I've married a wife, I cannot come. Now that says a lot about him, or says a lot about some, at least during that time when Jesus would be trying to extend the invitation to those to come follow him and to serve after him. That's the same sort of excuses that some would make. And one might say, well, I have a wife that I've got to spend more of my time with in this way. And we're not talking about and not even advocating that we should not spend time with our wife. That's not the case. Just simply stating that there are those that would, in their disposition and the way that they act on some occasion, demand all the time of the husband. And they don't always have all that time. There are things we need to give ourselves to, as she would need to do as well. And it could work both ways. When you start looking at the purpose of marriage, my friends, part of it being the process of procreation to all come about, and you think about how our society has been affected by the lack of appreciation for God's law in this regard. Now, it is the case that fornication does, some occasions, produce children. And those that are the parents and that child also have to live with the stigma of that illegitimacy, don't they? Had it been the case that they had followed and kept in mind what God's plan was and the matter of the purview he established for sexual purity, they would not have to be living with that stigma. Now that, of course, whatever those things may have been and whatever happens in that respect has happened, if we've been affected by that. I know nearly every one of us somehow or the other probably has been at some point in time. Nevertheless, in respect of that, what we have to take into account that there needs to be stronger teaching upon these particular precepts, and so that we maintain not only the purity of the individual, but the purity of the church, purity of our society. Our interest was, as it should be, as it was with Paul. These people were going to be affected by what was about to come upon them. We give up on our sense of purity and God's direction in this area. We're on our way to losing ourselves in every respect, because if we don't have the discipline to withhold ourselves in this regard, we won't much any other area either. So I think back again to what it was that he stated within the text. Marriage is honorable in all, and the marriage bed is undefiled. Now that's not something, again, that you're going to hear a great deal about in our news. You're not going to hear that taught in our schools much. They're doing everything that they possibly can to accommodate sexual immorality. Is that not correct, or have I missed that? Are not schools and things of this nature providing what it is that young people are needing to assist them in their sexuality so as not to produce unwanted children? Instead of teaching them that it's sinful and that there are consequences to sinful activity. Paul's admonitions so well needed in our world now. And they're so timely. And when you look into an eternal word, you begin to understand this is again why God has preserved these things for us now. Because he knows of our eternal need. He knows of our eternal wants, spiritually speaking, that we should have, that we meet His terms when it comes to matter of morality. I hope that some of the things that we've talked about in this respect will be helpful to us. That we walk from here and having a better appreciation for God's way of doing things. Perhaps having done that, we have an influence of good for others with whom we come in contact. If we're willing to stand by these principles, I am of the strong impression that we'll be heavily blessed by God. You know, our nation was, for many, many years, those that would be engaged in immoral activities, they were not exalted as they are now. And that's what's happening now. These people are exalted. And for those of us that would say this is sinful activity, how does society deal with us? They reprimand us as being hateful, speaking hate speech, and such things of that nature. That discourages many of us from touching on these subjects as God has outlined them for us. Perhaps, if we are impressed by God's teaching in this regard, we might be impressed by the Lord as the lawgiver when it comes to our eternal salvation. Should it be the case, peradventure, today that you're here and out of Christ, you realize that God's way is the only way. That perhaps upon the fact that you believe that Jesus is the Christ, that you would be willing to follow Him, noting Him as your Master, as your Lord. That means turning your life over to Him, exemplifying His life day by day. That's what's incorporated in the concept of faith in Him. And the repentance of our sin, now following His path. And then to wear that badge of discipleship that would come as a result of our having confessed His name with the mouth unto salvation, Romans 10 and 10. Should we upon that be willing to be immersed in water for the remission of our sins, where we're able to connect with the blood of Christ, Romans 6, 3 and 4, we'll be able to rise and walk in newness of life, being part of His family, having a hope that when we die, having been faithful, we'll be able to enjoy eternity with Him. Perhaps some have done those very things, but yet have become unfaithful, have sinned so as to reproach the body. Reconcile with God. Make oneself right today. While we stand, while we sing our song.